African countries, especially the ones in the Sahel regions, were given independence from their colonial masters. However, it was superficial. These African countries could not make their own policies or have their own currencies. They were even forced to sell their natural resources for pennies to their former colonial masters due to the world's most unfair agreements. It ensured that the West gets precious African resources without caring for Africa's poverty and its issues. If anybody raised questions, it was said that Africa was independent, but everybody knew this was rhetoric. Using a brutal network of agreements, sending troops for so-called ending insurgencies, and companies controlling resource sites, the West literally looted Africa. If any African leader wanted to get rid of this whirlpool, he was replaced using French troops encouraging coups in the country's military. That's when Africa came to know that French and UN peacekeeping troops and Western officials were actually controlling the countries. It was not much different than how colonial masters controlled their colonies. With only a few hundred officials, they ruled millions of people. After cracking this, recently, we have seen French troops and officials being kicked out of African countries. Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Niger have directed French officials and troops to leave their countries. This means that from now on, the West has started losing Africa. So, is it over for the West's post-colonial era? Let's find that out and know the whole story. The Sahel region in Africa was known for being poverty-ridden, politically unstable, and conflict-ridden nations. But today things have changed dramatically. The military takeover in Niger on July 26, 2023, transformed the region into a hotbed for coups, with many Sahel nations falling under the rule of unelected military leaders. This series of coups was a result of issues Africa was struggling with. The Sahel had become a focal point for violent armed groups, including Boko Haram, the Islamic State in West Africa province, and Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin. Alarmingly, the region accounted for a staggering 43% of global terrorism-related deaths, according to the Global Terrorism Index. Widespread corruption, extreme poverty, rampant unemployment, and a perception that Western partners and international organizations had failed to bring stability and security fueled discontent among the local populations in Sahel countries. This discontent led to support for coups and an increase in recruitment by armed groups. One significant factor that contributed to the rise of military governments in the region, in addition to persistent insecurity and economic instability, was the growing anti-French sentiment. The memory of French colonialism, marked by brutal military campaigns, forced labor, widespread repression, cultural eradication, racial segregation, and forced displacement, still haunted the Sahel region. Adding to these historical suspicions, France's recent setbacks and failures in Africa had further eroded trust in the former colonial power. Sahel populations had become skeptical of France's actions in the region. Coup leaders in many countries had exploited this deepening hostility, presenting themselves as anti-colonial heroes, resisting a neo-colonial France and its corrupt collaborators in local governments. This was why the masses had welcomed military rule with anti-French slogans in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and recently Gabon. This narrative could be traced back to 2012 when Mali had sought France's assistance to address a security crisis in its restive north. It was the regions where Tuareg rebels and fighters linked to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb had seized control of significant territory. France had deployed thousands of troops, with some assistance from Chad, to push the fighters away from the capital, Bamako. In 2014, with Mali's support, France expanded its counter-terrorism efforts in the region, launching Operation Barkhane, which involved 5,100 soldiers across 5 Sahel countries. Despite its considerable human and economic cost, Operation Barkhane had failed to achieve its objectives. Mali and the wider region had continued to grapple with problems, and armed groups had grown in strength and expanded their reach. Attacks on civilians had become commonplace, worsening the security situation across Sahel nations. As a result, local populations had begun to hold France responsible for their ongoing issues and had grown suspicious of France's intentions in the region. In 2020, after months of protests over deteriorating security and alleged corruption, a military coup ousted the pro-France government in Mali. Relations between Mali and Paris had soured, prompting Mali's new rulers to seek assistance from Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group to address the ongoing security crisis. Hence, it was impossible for French troops to be in Mali. France announced its decision to withdraw its troops from Mali and redeploy some of them to neighboring Niger as part of a new African strategy. However, this move did little to improve France's standing in the region. Niger soon witnessed its own coup, and with public opinion firmly against France, the coup leaders wasted no time in blaming France for the country's numerous problems, accusing it of destabilizing the country. France's rapid loss of influence and respect in the Sahel, where it was now widely perceived as a neo-colonial antagonist, could be primarily attributed to its flawed approach to the region's deepening security crisis. Instead of addressing the root causes of conflict by strengthening state institutions and promoting good governance, Paris focused solely on military solutions. This military-centric approach, which failed to yield decisive victories on the ground, exacerbated the conflict and turned public sentiment against France. But more countries were lying in wait to bring coups and expel French troops out. One of them was Burkina Faso, which officially ordered French military operations to end and French troops to leave the country. Back in January, Burkina Faso had given France a one-month deadline to withdraw its troops, terminating a military agreement that had permitted French forces to combat insurgents on Burkina Faso's territory. Burkina Faso had cited its desire to defend itself as the reason for this decision. French troops had done no good in their long stay in Burkina Faso. They had come to end terrorism and insurgency. However, these objectives did not seem to be on French troops' agenda. After seeing Mali and Burkina Faso kicking French troops out of their countries, Niger also decided to get rid of them. It was ordered that French troops should leave Niger after the French ambassador was asked to leave the country within 48 hours. Later, French President Emmanuel Macron announced the withdrawal of France's ambassador and troops from Niger. In a televised interview, Macron said, "France has decided to withdraw its ambassador. In the next hours, our ambassador and several diplomats will return to France." He also declared an end to military cooperation and disclosed that the 1,500 French troops stationed in Niger would withdraw in the months and weeks to come, with a complete withdrawal by the end of the year. The decision to depart Niger came after weeks of pressure from the military and public protests. Numerous demonstrations occurred in the capital Niamey, including outside a military base housing French soldiers. Niger's new leaders stated on national television, "This Sunday we celebrated a new step towards the sovereignty of Niger. This was a historic moment, which spoke to the determination and will of the Nigerian people." Well, this really was the start of a new era. This was certainly a victory for the government in transition, and perhaps an embarrassment for the French who had been asked by the government in place to leave the country, not only in Mali and Burkina Faso, but also in a third Sahel country. France knew it was losing everything. It knew it could not afford direct involvement, so it reached the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, asking it to impose sanctions following the July coup. The ECOWAS also warned of potential military intervention if diplomatic efforts to restore Bazoum to power failed as a last resort. The ECOWAS was being used as a tool by the West, and the three Sahel countries did something unimaginable for their security. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso formed a mutual defense pact on September 16 to address potential threats of armed rebellion or external aggression. This meant that if France used ECOWAS to interfere in any of the three countries, they would be united and declare war. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. After seeing all this, President Emmanuel Macron declared that the era of French interference in Africa was over now. "The era of Françafrique is long gone," Macron stated in a speech to the French community in the capital Libreville, referring to France's post-colonization strategy of supporting authoritarian leaders to safeguard its interests. Françafrique has faced criticism from Pan-Africanists for many years, who argued that after the wave of decolonization in the 1960s, France propped up dictators in its former colonies in exchange for access to resources and military bases. Macron and his predecessors, including François Hollande, had previously declared that this policy was obsolete and that France had no intention of interfering in the sovereign affairs of African nations. Now we know they really could not interfere. The reality had already struck them, and France knew that interfering directly or indirectly could make the matter worse. After several resets, the restoration of historical artifacts to former colonies, a reduction in its military presence, and the forging of new ties elsewhere on the continent, France's Africa strategy appears to have reached a standstill. Over the past 3 years, coups in half a dozen former French colonies in West and Central Africa, including recent ones in Niger and Gabon, have prompted reflection about what went wrong and how to potentially realign long-standing relations and interests. However, many argue that Paris can no longer dictate the course of events, as some African governments sever ties with France and form new relationships with foreign competitors, including Russia. Various newspapers in France, including Le Monde, recently stated, French influence in the Sahel has collapsed. It added, elsewhere on the continent, it is on the defensive, and nothing Paris says can restore it. Until now, French authorities had refused to acknowledge the military junta that seized power in Niger in late July, rejecting calls for the departure of its ambassador and 1,500 French troops stationed there. But now, it has accepted the reality and has announced to withdraw its troops. The power shift in Niamey followed a familiar pattern. Not long ago, Niger, along with neighboring Burkina Faso and Mali, cooperated closely with Paris in a broader Sahel alliance against a jihadist insurgency. All three nations have since witnessed the overthrow of civilian leaders by their militaries, followed by protests, some featuring Russian flags and slogans calling for the removal of French forces and diplomats. Well, it's because, in the late 1980s, France continued to support some hardline regimes that clung to power despite political uprisings. African youth saw that despite them rejecting their leaders, they were still in power. It was due to France backing them staunchly, allowing them to be in power whether people wanted that or not. African youth have now shifted their aspirations. They knew that instead of protesting against their leaders, their goals should have been aimed at Europe. Hence, we saw protests against France throughout the African continent. France came to know that this time, it could not interfere at all. While remaining silent on Gabon for now, French President Emmanuel Macron has decried an epidemic of coups in the Sahel. Since 2020, 2 other coups, in Guinea and Chad, have also occurred, with France responding with a mixed approach. In a lengthy interview in Le Monde, Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna defended France's Africa strategy. Colonna said, "Our relations with the continent cannot be viewed solely through the prism of the Sahel crisis. It's not 3,000 or 5,000 people demonstrating in a stadium in Niamey that can determine our relations with 1.5 million Africans. This suggests that France might not be in the mood to leave Africa, but the ground realities are different. If France wants to engage in willful thinking and says anti-French sentiments are of only a few thousand people, it's on the wrong path. The entire Africa wants France out, and perhaps France has to accept this, whether it likes it or not. France's position, she argued, is to listen to Africans, not to decide in their place. But what she said earlier is exactly the opposite of this. In February, Macron announced plans to reduce French forces in Africa and establish a new security partnership, with bases on the continent adapted to African needs and jointly managed with African staff. However, skeptics argue that Macron hasn't always followed through on his promises. They point to persistent signs of French influence, including thousands of troops stationed in Africa, long-standing mining agreements benefiting French companies, and the CFA franc, which requires West and Central African member states to deposit half their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. Anti-French sentiment is growing even in more stable countries like Senegal, where a youthful population is increasingly frustrated. Critics highlight what they perceive as a series of French missteps in the Sahel. Despite initial successes, France's decade-long counter-terrorism operation in the region lost local trust and was ultimately terminated last year due to a spreading insurgency. French troops had come to end terrorism in the Sahel region, but perhaps they forgot this sole agenda. The West has a habit of either creating or supporting problems which can clear its road for interference in countries it wants to go to. This was done with the Sahel regions. However, perhaps the West forgot that Africa had changed, and it had its eyes on whether French troops were doing their job or not. Since they were more interested in human rights violations and gold smuggling than in ending terrorism, they were better in France than in Africa. Now, the West is spreading another threat that France's decision to withdraw 1,500 troops from Niger creates a significant gap in combating insurgency and terrorism in Africa. This is being said so that African leaders should think twice before they expel French troops. Well, this could have been the case if French troops had been efficient in eradicating terrorism. Now, the extensive surveillance that France maintained just 2 years ago across hundreds of thousands of square miles of terrain has nearly disappeared. France has lost Africa, which marks the start of a new era. Now, the public in West African countries has become more cautious about hosting a Western military presence than ever. They know that even if any threats arise, they have to fight them by themselves, not calling the West for any kind of help. If France had any fraction of influence left in the Sahel region, coup would not have occurred at all. Just before the military leaders were thinking about carrying out coups, France would have known and prevented them. Even if they were carried out, they would be reversed within minutes. However, this did not happen. Over the past 3 years, a common thread has linked coups in 4 African countries. They were all former French colonies. For decades after decolonization, France continued to exert its influence and reap benefits in Africa. While this heavy-handed approach sometimes faced opposition, French-backed leaders often returned to power. Now, there is a shift in approach. Macron withdrew French troops from Mali last year following tensions with the ruling junta after a 2020 coup, and more recently from Burkina Faso and Niger for similar reasons. France also suspended military operations with the Central African Republic. Earlier, France would stir up conflict in the Central African Republic and put pressure on authorities to avoid implementing real development policies. Now, this influence has been taken from France and has been kicked out of Africa as a whole. France's declining influence in West Africa resembles a version of a sudden financial collapse. Over the past 3 years, a succession of coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Gabon, followed by French troop withdrawal, have slowly eroded France's position in Africa. Since France was the West's corridor into Africa, now the West has lost Africa and all its resources. What do you think? Is it for the West in Africa? Can the West, and especially France, survive without African resources, given it does not have any resources of itself? Let us know your thoughts on what will happen next, and whether the West will use its wicked plans to get control back. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned. Next video.